Hey good looking, welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for joining me. Today I have for you a video that I don't normally do. But I was asked by one of you if I would do it, and they really wanted to see what I had to say about it. Since I'm a single eyeshadow lover, I thought I would do for you guys the eyeshadow palette tag. This was originally started by Samantha March and Allie Glines, so I will link their channels down below. There's some really great beauty YouTubers that you can aspire to be like, and or just find some really great information beauty related. So without any further ado, let's get started. Kendra Morgan Official. I put out content generally centered around single eyeshadows, makeup brushes, and sunscreen with a side of palettes. So today we're going to do with the side of palettes because you know we like our macaroni and cheese more than we do our protein. Okay, so let's get started. All of the questions will be linked down below as well as the palettes. So if you want to cheat, you can just go down there and go ahead and take a look. Or you can stick around and watch me show and tell. I don't do this very often, so I'm like super excited to do this with you and just like sit here and, you know, goof off. Well, let's do the first question. First question is, what is your all-time favorite palette? Hands down, the very first palette that I ever received for Christmas of 2015 or 2016. It would have probably been 2016 or 2017 actually. No, it would have been 2016. And it is the Modern Renaissance. Is that not classic or what? Mine is very well loved, really inspired by warm looks since my eyes are blue. So just really fell in love with this palette when it first launched. And this palette and one other palette were the hard decision makers as to whether I was going to get this one or the other one and pick it out for Christmas. But I ended up going with this one, mainly because I think it's very beautiful. However, I did hesitate with the two pink shades because you know how I feel about pinks. I felt that way about pinks back then. But these two are actually berry tone and cranberry, so they really, really look beautiful on the eyes and have never, ever, it never ever fails me. I always get a really good look out of this. Okay, so we're back. Couple hours later, but no worries, I remember exactly where I left off. No, I don't. Anyways, so I think I talked a little bit about my all-time favorite palette, so it's just my well-rounded palette. Next up is what is a new favorite. So probably one of the newest to my collection is the Fairy Tale Forest by Lorac, and it is probably one of my newest favorites. I know I've mentioned this a couple of times, but these shimmers are very unique. They're very different than the normal Lorac palettes in the past. I picked up a couple of the original Lorac palettes just to compare. I thought, no way can they be that much different, and yes way they can. They are completely different. The entire formula is just completely different. Not only that, but the pans are removable from the palette, so it makes it really nice from a single shadow lover's perspective, you know, and it's just much more appealing. I have created some of the most beautiful looks out of this palette, and they don't ever turn out like they look like they're from this palette. So I don't know what it is, but it's just one of those like mystical palettes that you look at it, you're like, okay, this is neutral, and then it doesn't end up being quite looking neutral. It's like this color here is more orange than it looks. This green actually looks more of a green blue, and then this duochrome right here, butterfly, it just looks completely different on the eyes than it does in the pan. So a little bit of a chameleon palette, a little bit of a just outperforms itself really. Next question, this is, what is a palette you keep for the memories? And that has to be none other than my Too Faced Sweet Peach palette. I know a lot of you other content creators have put like a palette from a year ago or 2 years ago, and I'm thinking to myself, for the memories, what memories have you? I mean, yeah, I guess years time, but this has like been with me for a while. I can just barely smell the peach. It's long expired, but we went to Colorado one year for a vacation and I took this palette. We got some peaches from, not from Palisade, the peaches were from Palisade. We did not go to Palisade because it's too far west. But this is very, very memorable for me. I created probably a good dozen looks from this palette. Again, very versatile, even though it is within the neutral color story. I think it's a really fabulous find. I also found myself using this shade right up here as a highlighter. I mixed this shade with this shade as a blush one day. I'm trying to think of what else. Oh, Bellini. It's so pretty. Just some of these shades up here. Bellini and Luscious. Probably this shade Detectable. It's fairly dry, but it is also fairly beautiful on the lid. Let's get a little swatch here. There you go. It's really a palette before its time. Nothing about it says wow. Nothing about it says, like, you know, you're gonna create some kind of look that's just stunning, like, you know, the Huda Beauty Rose Quartz palette, but it's just an all-time favorite, and it stood with me for the some of the best memories I've had with this palette. So what's an underrated palette? This is kind of like a genre of palettes that I feel like are very underrated, and that is the LA Color, these types of palettes right here. I have the Rose palette. I was gifted this, I think, for Christmas. Yeah, I think it was Christmas, or maybe it was my birthday. This palette right here, super underrated. This whole line of palettes, actually. So this palette in particular, just beautiful. I have created some of the most stunning looks, and I told you I'm not a huge pink fan, but when you start getting into rosy, berry, crimson shades, those are the types of pinks that I truly like to wear, and this palette just blew my mind away. It's, to me, it's like right up there with Natasha Denona, or I wouldn't say Pat McGrath. Pat McGrath is kind of like, it's just different. Some of Pat McGrath, it's just different. But these shadows are spectacular. The palettes are nice. They're convenient. They did come with something, but I just, that one's gone. It's gone. I don't know who decides to put brushes with the palettes, but in my mind, that should never happen. This palette right here, though, is spectacular for the price, and I seen the price tag for them. You can get them at Dollar General here in the United States, and it is really affordable. And to think these are just like, yeah, I would rank them up there with my Natasha Denona palettes for sure. Does better than Urban Decay and Too Faced for sure. Maybe better than ABH. I'm not sure. Okay, let's keep things moving. If you're finding value in this content, you can always subscribe to my channel. That's free of cost to you, and it helps my channel out. So thank you so much. So what is a palette that isn't a favorite but you couldn't get rid of? This one was, it was actually very easy. Once I looked at all of my palettes, I was like, yeah, it's this one right here. And that is my Pat McGrath Labs Mothership Mega Celestial Divinity palette. Couldn't get rid of it, even though I didn't find myself using it as much as I thought I would. So I actually transformed this palette into singles that are manageable. You can take them out. You can either just pop them out via your finger or a magnet if you want, but there's actually, I have placed a little magnetic sheet here, and I'll go ahead and link that video in the eye for you. You guys can check out that video. But yeah, I use these as singles now, and now I get a lot more use out of it. But originally, I did not reach for this palette enough. And looking back now, I was very intrigued by the number and the variety of the shimmers. However, the mattes within this palette are pink, and this berry tone is okay, but it does blend out to be kind of pinky on the eye. I'm not a huge fan of that. And then of course you've got this deeper, richer, you know, red brown. So I'm assuming that's probably why. I have since, I think once I created an environment for this, I don't even know why I still have these things on there. I should have cut them off a long time ago, but I didn't. Anyways, once I created this as a palette of singles and I viewed it as a palette of singles, it became much easier to use from and pull from. I've taken this shadow out here numerous times, as well as this shadow, and this is Lunar Champagne. I've used that in a number of my dupe palettes, as well as just using it all over the lid. But it wasn't until I made this eyeshadow palette pans removable that I was able to get that. So Not really was able to get rid of it, but I made it usable again. What is your favorite collab? So I'm assuming they are talking about a collaboration where two brands or a brand and influencer put out a palette or an eyeshadow collection of some sort. And for me, this was a tie. I have two of them, and I think I only own two collabs. I really don't invest in collaboration palettes unless I kind of know the background or watched, you know, those people, and I know what I'm investing my money into, because I mean, it is an investment. Usually these palettes aren't cheap because we have a huge chunk of change going to the influencer. And the first one is probably going to come to a surprise as you, even though I talk some mad dog against Morphe and their eyeshadow brushes, I do think that Morphe put out a really good collaboration with Jaclyn Hill, and I do have this palette still. I don't know why I didn't make it in my declutter video. Actually, I do. It wasn't actually in the basket. It was behind something else. This is what I'm talking to you guys about. I lose makeup all over my house. Probably in every drawer in my home there is some makeup, guaranteed. That's just the way life goes. But anyways, this is probably one of my favorites, and I think it just really hits home because this was one of the first palettes that we saw that truly combined a pop of color with a neutral palette. And the neutral palette is definitely warm leaning. However, I think I've never really created a look with this palette that I didn't enjoy. So I don't know. I'll put up here a picture of something that I worked on, and it was a long time ago, back in my day when I just like loved makeup and loved more artistic planning and playing of the makeup than anything. I put together some cute little looks, but since then it's just been like use it as a transition shade, and then I pull out my Pat McGrath palette and use the shimmer that I want from the Pat McGrath. But nonetheless, very good. And the second one that ties in place with it is the Dose of Colors Desi x Katy Friendcation palette. This, again, like I've said before it's time, we have this shadow right here, which is a sparkly topper. Initially, when I used this palette, I saw it and I thought it was very beautiful, but I don't know what it was about the palette that made me think that these were like stark, crazy pigmented shimmers. This shadow, however, is not, and I don't think this green one is either, and this blue one is also a topper shade as well. And you can definitely tell it was a palette before its time, because palettes just weren't putting in these topper shades. That just wasn't what was going on. They were packing the punch with the pigmentation. They were giving you ultra glittery shimmers, ultra high shine shimmers, like we think of, you know, the Anastasia Beverly Hills with the sultry. Norvina palette had quite a few, although I retract that statement. I didn't, that one shade Dreamer and Norvina, I didn't really get along with it this last Shop My Stash video. But anyways, you can see right here, this was definitely a palette before its time. I think the mattes, they blend out beautifully. These shimmer shades, however, I would say this is probably one of those, you know, I'd reach for my Pat McGrath shimmers and plunk in that Lunar Champagne with a couple of these mattes in there. So, I mean, nothing to say bad about it. I really love it. But yeah, you can't really see. I don't have a dedicated video on it, and if I do have a dedicated video, you'll have seen some B footage, because I'll just go ahead and pull that. But just very beautiful. I'm not a blue person, but this little soft duochrome right here, this is definitely something I can get down with. So really love it. What is my 2021 favorite? Please, no introduction needed. The Flower Beauty Desert Lights palette right here, my 2021 favorite. The only way, I had this sitting on my vanity for about a month. The only way I stopped using this was I had to go put it in my little basket of eyeshadow palettes and force myself to take something else out, because I would find myself pulling these beautiful shadows right here out, and I would just plunk one all over the lid, and then maybe use this as a deepening shade. Maybe I wouldn't, just depending on what we went out and did. But this palette right here accentuates my blue eyes to no level I have ever experienced before. It is so incredibly beautiful. You know, just the shadows themselves. Look at the luster, look at the shine. The formula is what is just absolutely stunning. And I would have said the Jungle Lights, but I think Jungle Lights was actually 2020, and then the 2021 is this one. I recommend this palette for anybody who wants a high-end luxury feeling, experience, everything without the high luxury price tag. I would highly suggest these. For eyeshadows that are this creamy and malleable and buttery, they do stay on my lids far longer than some of my driest shadows that I own will stay. So that's saying a lot for this. Really think this is a very beautiful palette. It's not going to give you like any kind of clown makeup. It's not going to give you any kind of look that is going to be, you know, sinful when you go out somewhere. Like if you were going somewhere and you weren't sure how the makeup should look, you might pull this palette out, because this would just easily go on the lid and look so effortless and natural that people won't think you've overdone it. And that's really what I love about it. It brings a lot of confidence that way, because I don't have to worry about if people think like, oh, is this too much? When I use Pat McGrath shadows, when I use maybe not so much Natasha, but Pat McGrath for sure, that, you know, the Dose of Colors shadow palette, even that Morphe Jaclyn Hill palette, when I get those out, and my Lorac palettes too, sometimes I wonder if I overdo it, you know, like, oh, I'm overdoing the makeup. But with this, I know I'm not. I know I'm not. It brings the most beautiful shine and luster and pigmentation, accentuating the eyes very beautifully. And this satin right here is the perfect addition to this palette to just deepen up. But you can also throw it on for a smoky look and blend out the edges, and it just, so beautiful. I recommend this palette. It's my favorite release of 2021 for sure. What is an eyeshadow palette I didn't expect to love? This is probably not going to come as much of a surprise here. The Natasha Denona Biba. I didn't even want to own it. I guess I probably should go ahead and link for you guys in the my haul of 2021, my last haul of 2021, and that was that I placed a Natasha Denona order, and they ended up offering me something besides Lila, and I went ahead and got the Biba palette. I didn't think I would love it. I really didn't. I thought for sure, you know, it's okay, it'll provide some mattes when I'm trying to dupe palettes or just be a nice neutral palette, but I have grown to love this thing. I actually, and I'll link it in the eye for you, have a playlist of where I dupe this palette 4 or 5 times over. It's a mini series, you can go watch it. I'm slow on my feet, I'm just getting started, but I, you know, set out, I put that assignment on the table and I finished it and accomplished everything. And you know what? I'm glad to own this now because of it. I didn't think I'd like it, but I really do. Nothing spectacular about it. Again, if you don't own it, you're not missing out on anything, but it's just something that it's like, well, yeah, I'm really glad that I have it. What is a palette that sparks joy? I don't think there's any surprise that the actual shadow contained within this palette is called Sparks. So hint, hint, the Natasha Denona Gold. Sparks tremendous amount of joy. I really enjoyed picking this palette up. This was like an almost got away type of palette. Didn't think I was gonna like it that much, actually. I'm not a super huge fan of golds, but I don't dislike them by any means either. Not like my pink loathing. And again, the teals aren't my favorite, but this cream to powder formula and the 5 other formulas that are within this palette give this so much dimension, and it gives it so much variety that you really do find yourself using it and using it. And again, it's another one of those palettes where I had to close it up, put it in my palettes, and then re-choose something else because I just kept reaching for it and reaching for it and reaching for it. And I probably would continue to still have it if I hadn't taken it off my table or my vanity and put it away. So really sparks a lot of joy. These 2 shadows right here extremely beautiful. They are topper shades and they give a lot of versatility to any look. However, all of these mattes contained within the palette are extremely easy to use and also serve as a one shadow transition. So what I mean by that is I can place one shadow in the crease and blend it out and then place a little bit more, and it builds and builds and builds and gives you more depth. So really creates an effortless, you know, I can go in with one shade and I can get this ombre right on my eyes, a very blended look, and then just throw in one of the shimmers. And the shimmers, they come in a plethora of different formulas, so if one doesn't work for your eye, the other one might, and then you could always use one of the shimmers and then put a topper shade on top of it to add even more dimension. So just endless looks. Really, I every time I use it, I really feel inspired. So definitely one of my favorites. It's discontinued, however, so if you didn't get a chance to pick it up, I also put together a video on the best eyeshadows that I could find in my collection to dupe the palette. So check it out, and you know, if there's a shadow or two that you're interested in, you might consider hitting up that video and seeing what I recommend and seeing how it differs from the shades in this palette, and maybe how you might want to use some of those shades or something close to it. What's the newest eyeshadow palette in 2022? So the newest one in my collection is the Lorac Pro palette. I picked this up on before my no-buy year started, and it's kind of been the second half of the Fairy Tale Forest. Kind of gives me everything that the Fairy Tale Forest didn't. I did not realize, but Opal, a single shadow that you can buy on Lorac's website. Actually, I don't know if you can buy it on Lorac's website. They're out of stock on almost everything. So when I link it down below, it'll be through Amazon, and because that's really the only way that I can link something that's in stock. Thank you. So this one is the newest collection. I bought it at the end of 2021, but I just randomly picked a palette, and this is kind of the one that I wanted to talk about. Again, pans pop out. You've got 9 shimmers, 9 mattes, very beautiful, playful, warm eyeshadow tones. Of course, look really good on blue and green eyes. That's kind of a given. So like, this palette just looks really good on my eyes, and I don't have to think or wonder about it. When I went to Dallas over the break, I used this palette and I didn't have any problems finding enough texture or enough, you know, for how many shadows like this row right here. It seems like those shades are very similar and very close, and if you swatched them right next to each other, you would probably be like, well, you don't need all 3 of them, which might be true, but the plethora of different types of shimmers lends this versatility to this palette really exclusively, because it just, it travels really well too. It also has a mirror, but I just went ahead and taped the shade names onto it, but it's just really easy to use, really easy to travel with, and the looks don't look like they came from the same palette because of the versatility in the shimmers. So you've got a couple of, like those two right there, these two, I just went ahead and swatched on my fingers, but one is a topper shade, one is very much like a shimmer, like a traditional metallic, you might say. And then you've got Opal up here, and this is a very powerful, impactful shimmer, but it also blends out and shears out as a topper shade that's very similar to my Pat McGrath Astral Solstice, and my Spark shade from Natasha Denona. So therefore, I don't have to take those palettes with me to get that same effect. I can just kind of shear this one out, and it saves me some money too, because if I broke another shade in my Pat McGrath, or if I broke a shade from my Natasha Denona Gold, you know, I'd be out that shade. Well, obviously I'd repress it, but you know what I'm saying. You don't want to bring those expensive shades with you. You won't keep them home, keep them nice. So this palette right here, probably the newest and grooviest of 2022's palettes. So, oh my gosh, I almost dropped all of them. This is why I don't do palettes. If I drop one single eyeshadow, that's fine, but if I drop a palette, that's a lot of shadows I can break at one time. So why we don't keep all our chicks in one, or our eggs in one basket. So what's my first used palette in 2022? Stop the films. Stop them. So I want you guys to guess which one I use for 2022, because I think the answer will surprise you. I really do. I thought it was actually going to be the Soleil palette because, like I said, I mentioned in the very beginning, I took a little trip to Dallas, Fort Worth with my husband, and I actually took this palette with me. But this is not the first shadow or the first palette that I actually experimented with. I originally set out to take my Pat McGrath Mothership palette, the Midnight Sun. I gotta be real careful how I open it. So I actually used this first to make sure, like, yes, I do want to use this. Yes, I do want to take this with me. I actually had a look in mind, and I wanted a very wet, glossy eye with a very lined upper lid or upper waterline with a nice flirty lash. I think it was even these lashes that I took with me. And then I was just going to put a little bit of liner down here, neutral. And I really wanted to use this shade right here, or so I thought. I actually ended up taking this palette. That's how I know it's so versatile, because that's the one that actually ended up going with me. I did go ahead and take Ritz, but I actually never ended up using Ritz because Opal was way more than I needed it to be. And what actually stopped me from using this palette and taking it with me was not because of how incredibly expensive it is or the chance that, you know, I might break another shade on top of this Astral shade right here. But more so, the limiting factor was these 3 mattes right here are just mid to upper mid tone for my skin tone, and I wanted something that was just very subtle, like maybe 1 shade to a half a shade darker than my skin tone, and I wanted that to be in the crease. So I definitely got that from this Soleil palette, which is why I tell you, when you see these 3 shades like right up here, they all look very similar. I'm serious, they do look very similar, but you can see, like, even just the difference between these 2 right here, it's tremendous. And something like that really makes all the difference in the world when you're trying to get a wet look on the eyelid with like a shadow effect, not a contoured eye, but a shadowed eye is how I would describe it. Anyways, I ended up using this palette in 2022 to try to achieve that look, and I found out that this is just way, it was just way too dark for me, way too dark. And I went in with the lightest of hands, and then I went back over it with this shade right here. I tried using just this shadow and this shadow, and I couldn't get anything to work. So it just didn't look the way I wanted it to look for my evening out with my husband that I was going to have, but nonetheless, really loved it. And in fact, I'll go ahead and slide in a picture right up here. That was me just right after I had gotten ready, and you could see it's just like a really neutral eye. It just looks like wet. I just wanted a really wet look, kind of similar to this, but not as contoured, not as defined. I wanted the definition to be so subtle that people wondered whether or not I actually had eyeshadow on, and like maybe I just had a wet glossy eye look. So anyways, this ended up being the palette that I used first for 2022, but it was not the palette that ended up going with me on my date weekend with my husband. So thanks so much for staying tuned to the video, and I hope you guys had and enjoyed your time here. Let me know which palettes down below are your favorite palettes for 2021. What's the first palette you used for 2022? Let me know in the comments down below. I can't wait to see you in my next video. Bye.